Welcome to Philosophy 3400 Ethics. Today we're looking at sections 33, 36, and a few other nearby sections of Minima Moralia. Section 33, titled Out of the Firing Line. I want to skip to page 55 here, look at a passage, and then we'll talk about that. This is, I think, the most important section here. Okay? And this is the kind of reflection, I think, that that Adorno's offering here after World War II and after the Holocaust is something that anybody might ask themselves after some outrageous atrocity has been brought to light that that one's country bears responsibility for. So while this is a Jewish German philosopher, Theodor Adorno, reflecting on World War II and the Holocaust in the 1940s, I think anyone can ask themselves questions like this when they reflect on their own country's history and terrible crimes, for instance, that might be buried in the past or with us even in the present. So it's a wider scope than merely some historical reference to a specific event in Europe in the 40s, though it is that, I think, specifically, it has much wider ramifications. Not only do I believe this about Adorno's writing, but Adorno himself has made this clear many, many times in many different works, that what he's talking about here is not just something that Germany needs to be worried about, but that everybody, he thinks, in the West needs to be worried about. The idea that after this war, this is the bottom paragraph on page 55, the idea that after this war life will continue normally, we could think about the crises we're in right now and this idea to get back to normalcy. I think even here, right, what we've witnessed over the past year has been traumatic for a lot of people in a variety of ways. We've seen a series of crises having to do with the climate, having to do with racism and social justice, having to do with the integrity of our elections, having to do with people's ability to earn a living for themselves and to move around freely in the public spaces. A lot of people wonder, is there, when will we get back to normal? Can we get back to normal? Will we ever? Right? Now, of course, World War II and the crises of that war and the Holocaust, I think, are much more visceral. But nonetheless, right, anytime you're faced with a crisis that has brought sort of everything to a grinding stop in some sense and revealed a bunch of problems that maybe were being ignored, you have to ask yourself, moving forward, how do we get past this? How do we make this right? How do we ever sort of return to some semblance of normalcy given what has just occurred? And so every day in this country formerly, when people used to move around in public and there'd be some terrible mass shooting, people might ask themselves a version of this question. Or even today, people isolated for the last year and wondering when they'll ever be able to return to some sort of normal life they had been used to, may have a version of this question. Nonetheless, let's look at the question, the issue that Adorno is raising here on page 55 in its specificity now. And its historical reference. The idea that after this war, World War II, life will continue normally, or even that culture might be rebuilt, as if the rebuilding of culture were not already its negation, is idiotic. Millions of Jews have been murdered, and this is to be seen as an interlude and not the catastrophe itself. What more is this culture waiting for? And even if countless people still have time to wait, certainly not the victims, right? It is conceivable that, is it conceivable? So even if countless people still have time to wait, obviously not the victims, is it conceivable that what happened in Europe will have no consequences? That the quantity of victims will not be transformed into a new quality of society at large? Barbarism, in other words, isn't the danger that what we saw in the Holocaust will actually become systematic in the new, not normal, but the new status quo. As long as blow is followed by counterblow, catastrophe is perpetuated. One need only think of revenge for the murdered. if as many of the others are killed, horror will be institutionalized. So for example, if the solution here is to round up everybody complicit with the Nazis and execute them en masse, right, to execute them all together, then won't we just have sort of now a revenge that will then lead to further mass bloodlettings, right? So if as many of the others are killed, horror will be institutionalized, and the pre-capitalist pattern of vendettas, right, vengeance, blood vengeance, confined from time immemorial to remote mountainous regions, okay, will be reintroduced in extended form with whole nations as the subjectless subjects. Exactly who's responsible for this, it'll start to be unclear who started it, so to speak, and we'll just have an endless cycle of tit for tat mass violence. If, however, so that's on the one hand, that's not the outcome anybody in their right mind would want. However, on the other hand, he says, if, however, the dead are not avenged, right, so if we just let everybody get away with this Holocaust, and mercy is exercised, fascism will, despite everything, get away with its victory scot-free. And having once been shown so easy, will be continued elsewhere. There's a similar, but on a lesser scale, there's a similar version of this debate right here that Adorno's bringing up with reference to the Nazis in World War II, with the discussion today that you find in the public sphere around what is to be done with the insurrectionists of January 6th, right? On the one hand, you engage in too much punishment that will further polarize and stir up and just lead to a reaction of even more militant folks or something like this, versus letting people go without any consequences, right? So we can think even of, you know, smaller scale ramifications and versions of this that are with us today. The logic of history, he goes on, is as destructive as the people that it brings to prominence. Wherever its momentum carries it, it reproduces equivalents of past calamity. Normality is death. So, okay, Adorno, please tell us again. So he's going to say it in the very next lines. What should be done then, right? And that's the question here. Okay, you've told us that sort of both possibilities here of visiting upon the oppressors the very injustices they have perpetrated on others, right? To do that is to just sort of turn justice into mere vengeance and to prolong barbarity. But on the other hand, to simply let people get away with this kind of fascist violence will mean that fascism wins and the violence of fascists will continue in perpetuity. Neither of those two possibilities or options seems very desirable. So what should we do, Adorno, right, with defeated Germany? Should we? The answer is not kill all Germans, right, for what they did to Jews, right? So that's not going to be the answer. But at the same time, the answer isn't to let people go free and just say, well, everybody makes mistakes. Try better next time. So what do we do then? He says, I can only say two things in reply. Firstly, at no price and on no conditions would I wish to be an executioner or to supply legitimations for executioners. So I'm not going to advocate that we execute Nazi war criminals or anyone complicit with them. Secondly, I should not wish, least of all with legal machinery, to stay the hand of anyone who is avenging past misdeeds. In other words, and yet, just because I don't want to execute them, and I personally would find that abhorrent, I'm not going to try to prevent anybody, you know, who has been wronged here, who has lost family members, who was imprisoned in the camps, from seeking vengeance for what has been done. This, as he puts it, this is a thoroughly unsatisfactory, contradictory answer. But know what he says here. But perhaps the fault lies in the question and not only in me. So this is just, he thinks, the honest answer here that he can give, and what it, you know, what it's getting at is that he understands, right, that justice requires consequence and accountability. And yet, on the other hand, he certainly doesn't want to himself perpetuate the very kinds of injustices that were perpetrated. In other words, for instance, mass executions without much of a trial. Just line them all up, try them all at the same time, execute them all for the fact that they were Germans who were at all, in any ways, complicit with the persecution of the Jews during World War II. On the other hand, he says, again, right, for those who have been wronged, and Adorno, let's not forget, he himself is one of these, right? I should not wish to stay the hand of anyone avenging past misdeeds. Well, Adorno has been wronged, and people he knew, and even family members, suffered and even died at the hands of the Nazis. And yet, what he's getting at here is, I will not, be seeking vengeance, and I don't want to try to legitimate public executions and government executions. However, I also think that those pursuing vengeance are doing something understandable, that I'm not going to stand in the way of them doing this. Okay. So let's move forward then to the next section, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is 36. 36, then 40 and 41. Moving into section 36, the health unto death. Here he's going to, the background here is the Nazi cult of health and the sort of promotion of physical strength as demonstrating a kind of almost classical ideal of beauty and virtue. And one of the things I think he gets at here that would be worth tracing further, right, is the idea that what is being called health in a popular sense, he thinks, is a sort of socially acceptable and conventional sickness. And what is often characterized as various mental and psychological pathologies, he thinks, are real and in some sense genuine responses to social abnormalities. So in other words, there's a lot going on here that I think is filled out further at length by one of Adorno's colleagues, Erich Fromm, in his book, The Sane Society. And there's a tradition in France as well, and in other places, even including Scotland, R.D. Ling. There's a tradition of anti-psychiatry that comes out of reflections like this, and that is ultimately going to postulate that what we call psychology is a form of social control over people who are experiencing real symptoms that are a result of an unhealthy society and an unhealthy economic organization and political organization of our societies. So in other words, those who are suffering from mental illness are, in a sense, more authentic and having a more genuine experience, whereas those we call healthy and normal have simply accustomed themselves and been conditioned to accept and to treat as normal what are in fact pathological social and economic conditions. So I think that's my summary of this section, in a nutshell. And again, I would, just refer you to further similar reflections in a book by Erich Fromm, the German Jewish psychologist, who is another member of the Frankfurt School, who's a colleague of Adorno's, who comes to the United States like Adorno, but stays and becomes a popular author who's very famous in the middle of the 20th century. And again, the Sane Society is the place that I think look for this passage to be further filled out there. Now let's get to sections 40 and 41. Always speak of it, never think of it. Let's have a look at this section. We'll just let's just start by reading it a little bit here. Now the depth psychology, with the help of films, soap operas, and Karen Horney, a psychologist who was famous at this time, I believe it's Karen Horney, has delved into the deepest recesses, right? So now that we have all this decades of psychological research and study of people, and of mental illness, and of abnormality and normality, people's last possibility, Adorno writes, of experiencing themselves has been cut off by organized culture. We have no direct sort of access to ourselves that isn't already mediated by a commercial commercial media that Adorno characterizes as the culture industry. Ready-made enlightenment, if you're wondering what this is, go to the nearest bookstore. You might have to go to Modesto, Barnes & Noble. There's a section there called self-help. Ready-made enlightenment. What do you need to do? Five easy steps to turn your life around and make $1 million, to be fulfilled. Ready-made enlightenment turns not only spontaneous reflection, but also analytical insights into mass-produced articles. And the painful secrets of the individual history, which the orthodox method is already inclined to reduce to formulae. So even in psychoanalysis, when you sort of get their unique singular patient, the unique singular analyst, and even there he says there's already a sort of tendency to reduce what's happening to certain Freudian formulae into commonplace conventions, but he says this is even worse in the realm of pop psychology. Dispelling rationalizations becomes itself rationalization. And of course the goal of Freudian psychoanalysis is to help us dispel rationalizations, that is to learn the ways in which our own process of reasoning is compromised by our own sort of desires, and to understand that we are in a sense deceiving ourselves. And that's why we continue to sort of experience traumas. And if we can just identify this harmful pattern that we're not fully aware of, and how our reason is being twisted or something by traumas we've experienced and specific desires related to that, then we will be enlightened, we will free ourselves from the burden of our past traumas. Well, when you reduce this to a kind of formulaic way of doing things, then this very process itself becomes a kind of bogus reasoning and rationalization itself. Instead of working to gain self-awareness, which is the goal of therapy, the initiates here become adept at subsuming all instinctual conflicts under such concepts as, and now we get a bunch of jargon given to us by pop psychology in a Freudian vein, which is obsolete at this point, but we still have a lot of pop psychology here. And we get all these little categories. You're this personality type, you're that personality, you're an introvert, you're an extrovert, etc. And this gives people a sort of superficial way of understanding themselves that actually stands in the way of genuine self-understanding. And so in a sense it's a perversion of psychoanalytic therapy, which aims to free us from the weight of our past traumas and how they have distorted our personality and leave us neurotic. Instead we just learn a pseudo-psychological jargon that gives us a pseudo-mastery over ourselves, more or less. Okay. Terror before the abyss of the self is removed by the consciousness of being concerned with nothing so very different from arthritis or sinus trouble. There's an immense trivialization of trauma, its impact on us, and how early childhood experiences really come to manifest themselves in our later character formation, and just how unaware we are of certain fundamental realities about ourselves that are, that there's a kind of natural resistance to making completely transparent without the help of a skilled analyst, right, who's there to elicit this, right, by getting us to just free associate and talk about our dreams and and to sort of elicit from our subconscious and bring to consciousness things that we would prefer to remain hidden there. Catharsis, unsure of success in any case, and that's what psychoanalysis, kind of like the classical tragedy, aims to produce in us, right? It is to stir up these repressed, painful emotions that have to do with often traumas from early childhood. Stir them up. They're dangerous, right? But they then elicit this emotional response in us of grief, of anger, frustration, sadness, and then we sort of expel what otherwise kind of stews there in a toxic way and is going to poison us. So catharsis, which is the goal traditionally in psychoanalysis here, unsure of success in any case. It's not as though this is an infallible method. It's an art. Is supplanted by pleasure at being in one's own weakness a specimen of the majority, right? So now instead I take refuge in the fact that pop psychology is telling me that we're all struggling with our mental health here, and so I don't have to really worry about getting better anymore. I just have to learn to accept the mental health issues I have and learn a sort of jargon to talk about them. And he thinks ultimately this normalizes abnormality, frankly. and it accustoms us and conditions us to accept whatever status quo we exist in as the only normal way to do things, and the problem then lies with us and our failure to adjust to it. The problem, he thinks, instead lies with the system that we're in, and adjusting to it is making ourselves mentally ill, he thinks. Okay, moving on to 41 here. I want to try to do this in a timely manner today and see if we can run through these sections somewhat more quickly. I just want to look at then at section 41 and we'll wrap this up here. Inside and outside. And I want to skip the beginning here. And so, here we go. So one of the things he's getting at here, inside and outside, is that it's hard to be an intellectual these days, I think, is Adorno's claim here. And he is an intellectual, and he feels like basically there's no way to successfully earn a living as an intellectual any longer. And here's why. And it's not as though you can't become a professor, right, or to be a learned person of some kind who's paid to do things. So what is he getting at here? Those who throw in their lot, this is on page 66, section 41, those who throw in their lot with salaried profundity. So maybe you're an author who's publishing these self-help books at the bookstore, or maybe you're a professor who's there to, expound on some discipline, complex material of some kind. Or maybe you're just a public intellectual, somebody writing for a journal, a newspaper, etc., making speeches in public. Okay, so those who take this route of salaried profundity are compelled to be at each moment as naive as the colleagues on whom their careers depend. What does he mean there, to be at each moment as naive as the colleagues on whom their careers depend? Extra academic thinking, however, which seeks to escape such compulsion, with its contradiction between high-flown subject matter and petty-minded treatment, faces a scarcely lesser threat, the economic pressure of the market, from which in Europe the professors were at least protected. Well, that protection's over, but yes. What he's getting at here then is, on the one hand, if you take the route of salaried profundity, you accept the salary to be an intellectual of some kind, and then you are essentially put into a system that forces you to be, as he puts it, naive. That is, to play a certain kind of game and pretend as though you're not playing that game. And what is that game? Well, it's a battle for prestige, sort of turf battle between different people who will claim exclusive possession of competence and deny competence to others, and pecking orders and establishment of hierarchies and whatnot. But extra academic thinking, so maybe the idea is, okay, well, don't attach yourself to a government organization, don't attach yourself to some university. Instead, just be an independent scholar, right? Maybe you hit the lottery and you don't have to worry about money, or maybe you do this in your off time, but the idea is nobody can tell you what to think now. You're not getting paid by anyone. You're not part of some hierarchy where the chain of command can interfere with what you're doing. So extra academic thinking, which seeks to escape such compulsion, with its contradiction between high-flown subject matter and petty-minded treatment, right, has to deal with the economic pressure of the market. In other words, the only thing harder than being an intellectual at a university or working for the government in some capacity in some agency or part of some non-governmental organization or think tank or etc., nothing harder than that is trying to make it on your own without any of that support. The market essentially doesn't have much of a place to reward people economically for this kind of work, however valuable it ultimately might turn out to be down the road. The philosopher who wishes to earn his living as a writer, and this would also hold incidentally, so you don't have to get too hung up here on the specificity here of this claim about a philosopher. This would hold for somebody who wants to sing for a living, right? Somebody who comes to Stan State and becomes a vocal major and just wants to sing, or somebody who wants to play a musical instrument, or somebody who wants to paint, or somebody who wants to dance, or somebody who wants to sculpt. We can go on, right? Somebody who wants to do something beautiful or wants to just pursue the truth without any necessary concern for immediate applications. The philosopher who wishes to earn his living as a writer is obliged at each moment to have something choice, ultra-select, to offer, and to counter the monopoly of office with that of rarity. So often, then, you're put on the spot. Show us what you can do, you weird person who's pursuing something that seems to have no value or not be valued very highly in our society. Art, music, or philosophy. What's so special about that? Show me, right? Give me an elevator pitch. Give me in 5 seconds, 5 minutes, whatever the case might be. Tell me why this is important, why this matters. In other words, dance, right? Impress me. Otherwise, you must be full of it and you have nothing to offer. The repulsive notion of the intellectual tidbit, right? You're wise, you're a philosophy professor. Tell me what the meaning of life is in a minute or less while we're in the grocery line. The repulsive notion of the intellectual tidbit, conceived by pedants, finally proves humiliatingly applicable to their opponents. And so, in other words, right, this ends up being used as a way of keeping people in line or sort of denigrating them, right? If you can't make this intelligible to a general audience in a minute or 5 minutes, then the problem must be that what you're doing doesn't make sense, and not that the general level of education isn't such as to allow most people to grasp the complexity of what you're up to. Okay. Let's just look at the end here. A gaze averted from the beaten track, right? A hatred. So what does that mean? A gaze averted. Somebody who's just kind of not going along with the status quo. Somebody who just is paying attention to the things others ignore, such as maybe philosophy, right? Something that's not paid much attention to and most people have very little understanding of anymore. A gaze averted from the beaten track. A hatred of brutality. A search for fresh concepts, not yet encompassed by the general pattern, is the last hope for thought. So this is what we need, he thinks, is to sort of turn away from what is being offered in the public sphere as intellectual activity. In an intellectual hierarchy which constantly makes everyone answerable, and certainly universities would fall under what he's talking about here. Everyone has to be answerable. They have to demonstrate and prove, right, that they are competent, that their answers are correct, that other people are mistaken. And then a pecking order and a hierarchy sort of emerges from out of who wins these kinds of battles. In an intellectual hierarchy which constantly makes everyone answerable, unanswerability alone can call the hierarchy directly by its name. A refusal to answer in such terms, right? The circulation sphere, whose stigmata are borne by intellectual outsiders, opens a last refuge to the mind that it barters away at the very moment when refuge really no longer exists. And this is very paradoxical, but what he's getting at here is that there is a refuge open to the mind, right, of unanswerability, of refusing to conform and refusing to answer to this hierarchical demand from above. Justify what you're doing, explain it in its practical implications, do so quickly, or else we're going to infer that you're full of it and that what you're doing has no value, which is the death of theoretical pursuits in general, right? That destroys the possibility of theory. And we don't want to do that, since history shows that theoreticians have anticipated and been responsible for immense practical transformations. It's just an indirect relationship, and that often there's a lag where practice comes long after the theory. People begin to figure out the practical implications, often a century or two later. But we'll never have that anymore if we eliminate theory entirely, eliminate its unanswerability to practice, right? Einstein can simply contemplate the nature of the universe and come up with his general and special theories of relativity, and never had to justify that because he wasn't working for anyone, by the way. He was working in a patent office and not working for a university. And so nobody was telling him, hey, you better conduct some experiments that show us what we can do with your theory, or else you're going to get out of here and be fired. And so he just pursued his theoretical interests to their furthest limits and changed the way human beings think about the world. And guess what? Later on, decades later, people came along and did immensely significant things with Einstein's discoveries. Nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, other applications. And yet the idea is if Einstein had had to justify what he was doing all along, he never would have been able to get there in the first place. People would have said, what can we do with this, before they would let him spend that much time and fund him to do it, right? And so then, in other words, we would actually end up, without meaning to, we'd end up preventing all sorts of discoveries from being made by eliminating the pursuit of theory for its own sake. Okay, I think we've said enough. I have to go now. This is going to be plenty sufficient for these sections. Thank you for joining me.